Hi, we're going to learn about generic disads. Generic disads are disadvantages that you can read most of the time because they apply to most positions. Generic disads are important in parliamentary debate, really in all formats of debate, but especially in parliamentary debate because in parliamentary debate you only get like 20 minutes to prepare. It's not possible for you to do really amazing research in that amount of time. And so it's important that you have positions that you can leverage kind of on most topics. And I think that because of this, a lot of topic writers go out of their way to try and write topics which link to generic disads. So we're going to talk about the generic disads that I think are most useful. Tawny, if at any point the writing goes out of frame, let me know. So let's start by talking about generic disads. Now, technically there's like any number of generic disads, but there's only three I really want to talk to you about today. The first one is going to be confidence disads. I'll explain what I mean, but we're talking about econ disads basically. Confidence disads. The second thing that I want to talk to you about is going to be hegemony disads, or hedge disads as we call them. And then the last thing I want to talk to you about are politics disads, which are also called ticks for the record, disads. And we'll be talking about specific versions of each of these three kinds of things as we go through the discussion today. But these, I would say, represent in most years, for most topics, these standard three kinds of disads. And I want to start by breaking down confidence disads and making clear what I mean. I would say my personal favorite, and the one that we read the most at DVC, is going to be business confidence disads. Business confidence, business, it's two S's, confidence. And I usually abbreviate that to BizCon. So if you want to sound cool, that's what you say. Okay, first things first, you would need to know what business confidence is, or understand the idea of like confidence or kind of economic indicators in general. Roughly speaking, business confidence, if we're saying high business confidence, is the idea that businesses, corporations, etc., perceive that their business is likely to grow, or at least it's not going to be constrained, be restricted, or shrink in any meaningful way. So high business confidence means businesses effectively are projecting there will be growth in the market or in their industry, and as a result, it makes sense for them to sort of expand their business, to reinvest in their business. And that can be manifested in hiring people, research and development, increasing salaries, offering more competitive things to employees, etc., etc., etc. But bottom line, if you are confident in the market, you would do those things because you expect to make more money in the long term anyway. Now, if business confidence is low, what you're saying is you think you're probably going to start losing money, or at a minimum start making less money, and as a result, it makes sense for you to not hire more people, maybe even to lay people off, maybe to make cutbacks, maybe to stop funding research and development, things like that. And there are alternative forms of confidence disads, right? Investor confidence, you're saying the same thing about investors. Investors don't think the market's going to grow. Consumer confidence, consumers think they're not going to be seeing increases in wages, or things like inflation will mean their buying power, their spending power is reduced, and so they're not going to engage with the market, and that will hurt the economy. But let's stick with business confidence. How do most people read business confidence disads, and why do I think they are dumb for doing it, or at a minimum are cowards? So, most business confidence disads look something like this. Step one, businesses and business is good. Okay, businesses are making mad stacks. Okay, and then the plan happens. Because the plan happens, businesses freak out. And because they freak out, the economy goes down. And economy going down means less wages, people are homeless, potentially war, depends on how silly you want to get. But that's the basic story of most people's business confidence disads. And I don't think that's a very compelling story. And I was just explaining to my students why I think that's the case. But to reiterate that, there's kind of a cognitive dissonance here. In this step, what we're saying is, and again, this is a generic disad, so we're reading this on just about any plan the affirmative might do. In this step, we're saying businesses are so goddamn stupid that if anything happens at all, anything even minorly inconvenient for them, their reaction is to take their clothes off and piss all over themselves and to not know what to do anymore, think the sky is falling, freak out. But we started off by saying businesses are doing really good. And it's quite confusing to live in a world where businesses are capable of doing really good and in theory, as a result, are smart, but also the slightest change is going to cause a massive problem. And this is where thumpers come in, right? So for those of you who don't know what a thumper is, thumpers are sort of uniqueness or link level arguments, quick defensive arguments you can read that tend to look like other examples of things that are relevant to the topic that should be causing or should have already caused this similar problem. So if I'm addressing something written like this, and what the plan is saying, or what the negative is saying is doing anything is going to cause businesses to freak out, all I'm going to do is read a list of 7 things that are going to happen in the next few weeks in Congress or in the United States that would also cause this disad to happen, which means it's inevitable and not a reason to reject the affirmative. Because your thesis is really weak. Okay, it doesn't make sense. Businesses are just stupid. They're going to freak out no matter what, apparently. How do we fix this? How do we make this a little bit more sophisticated? I think it's much better to explain your internal link and link analysis to be about regulatory certainty, which I'll explain in a second, and to frame businesses as incredibly smart throughout your entire story. Okay? So, regulatory certainty. Let's start with what this means. Conceptually, businesses want to know whether regulations are going to increase in the short and long term or whether they're going to decrease in the short and long term. And a lot of the times, they actually don't mind if things are going to get worse for them. They just hate when they don't know it's going to happen one way or the other. Because if you know things are going to get bad, you can plan around it. But if just all of a sudden things get good or bad, that can cause issues for you. So the thesis I think you want to explain is that the plan in some way interrupts regulatory certainty, okay? Now why would that be the case? In debate, we don't debate things that actually are going to happen. Because if we did, there would be no inherency for those arguments, right? The silly example I gave earlier is that if the resolution was the United States should hold midterm elections in November of 2022, the negative could stand up and say they're already going to do that, and then the app would lose. So inherently, any plan the affirmative gets asked to pass on a topic is something that out of nowhere has appeared, and as a result, disrupts regulatory certainty. And when I say we should characterize businesses as smart, what I'm really trying to say is, if your story instead is not something happened and businesses pissed themselves, but instead your story is something happened, businesses recognize that this disrupted their ability to accurately project into the future, and any smart business that feels incapable of knowing whether they're going to grow or shrink in the future is going to play it safe and choose to constrain their business, lay people off, not give salary increases, not hire people, etc. That to me makes a lot more sense, and it's a lot more sophisticated. But the second thing that does for you that I think is really important is it makes the debate no longer about the size of the link. Okay, I want to be really clear on this. Thumpers work because there are similarly sized pieces of legislation or actions that are going to occur which are like the plan and therefore would also trigger the link. But if your link is about regulatory certainty, it's not about the size of the plan, it is about its sudden appearance out of nowhere that disrupts this process. Why don't thumpers work anymore in that world? Well, if someone says there's 7 other bills that are going to pass, you can say that is already priced in to the business plans of large businesses. For instance, pretty much everyone knows that in November, something's going to happen with the interest rate because that's been announced. That's not a thumper if your link is about regulatory certainty, because they already know that. That's already in the projection, already a part of the plan. However, if your story goes back to just being any small thing will freak out businesses, now that does take out your position. So as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to business confidence, story is businesses are smart. It is a smart decision to react in this specific kind of constraining way. And you want your link and internal link story to primarily be about regulatory certainty because it lets you skirt the thumper discussion and is therefore more strategic and a little bit more nuanced. So that is my approach to business confidence. I've got kids behind the camera, you can't see them in theory. Questions on this, folks? Are we good on this? And we can move on to the next one. Sick. We're moving on to the next. They gave me thumbs up. I'm really good at my job. It sure would be a shame if I didn't, get hired to do it full time, wouldn't it? That'd be weird. Anyway, let's go. Oh, just kidding. Let's go on. I don't know why I erased the other list of generic diss ads. We're moving on to the next one, which is hegemony. What? Correct?
No. I thought you were going to do generic advantages.
Anyway, you be quiet, Tio. Stay off playing.
This isn't about you.
It's not about him. We'll edit him out. Anyway, hegemony.
Censored to you.
Hegemony. Okay. First question you have to answer. If you're a noob, what is hegemony? Hegemony, or hedge, as we tend to call it in debate, is the idea of a nation state or an actor having the ability to influence the world, having the ability to project power, whether that is within their own nation, outside of their own nation, so on and so forth. And so, when we talk about hegemony, we're talking about, generally speaking, the hegemony of the United States relative to the hegemony of other nations. Now, sometimes it's China hedge or Russia hedge, but almost always it comes back to the United States. So, hegemony disads can go either way, but most of the time, in the most effective versions of hegemony disads, basically say, 1, hedge is good now, but tenuous. 2, plan happens. 3, everyone dies. All right? And there's different speeds and different routes to everyone dying, but hedge loves to get to everyone dies, usually from nuclear war. And hegemony is another one of those things where when we talk about it, it's important to understand different perspectives as it pertains to hegemony. So I'm actually going to break this one down kind of in reverse compared to the other one, where instead of starting with like that story, let's talk about why does hedge actually matter? Like, why do we care about hedge? What kind of impact scenarios and what kind of internal link scenarios do we tend to see from hegemony disads? Okay. Can we see if I rest up over here, folks? So look at the camera like you. Great, awesome. Okay, so let's start with the most basic ones that I like to talk about. First hedge scenario that I'm a big fan of is going to be allied confidence. Okay? What is allied confidence? Allied confidence is the idea that the allies of a given nation, again in this instance the United States, feel they can rely upon the United States to protect them, or to help serve their interests, or to, scare off their enemies, or whatever. And crucially, in most instances, this is explained in the context of those nations not needing to do some wild shit on their own. Okay? So when we're talking about allies of the United States, we're talking about nations like Israel, nations like South Korea, nations like Taiwan, nations like Japan, for instance, right? Those are kind of the big ones that usually come up in those discussions. Ukraine, I guess, obviously is relevant now. Israel, in debate, a lot of time gets painted as like this loose cannon. You know what I mean? Like, hey, do they have nukes? I don't know, but I know they're trying to do like a genocide. They seem like not the best guys, and like also they hate all of their neighbors, and all of their neighbors hate them. And so, sure would be a shame if they did secretly have those nukes everyone thinks they have, because you know, if they can't rely on the umbrella of the United States, maybe they freak out and they send a weapon off, right? And so under Allied confidence, the first thing is this idea of Allied freakout. Okay? So that could manifest itself in, you know, Israel first striking Iran, meaning being, you know, launching a weapon of some capability. Could be a nuke, could just be carpet bombing Tehran or Saudi Arabia or whatever they want to do. But Allied freakout. Our allies freak out because we can't support them. Now, part of this is rooted in one step back, the concept of realism. And for those of you who don't know what realism is, Google it, look up John Mearsheimer. But secondarily, to just summarize it for you, realism is a philosophy of international relations that has a few tenets to it, but the most crucial for our moment in time is nations, want to survive, right? They want the best things for the nation, they want to be alive and all that good stuff. And B, can never really know who is a friend and who is not a friend. You always have incomplete information about everyone but yourself. And lastly, C, which is really important, there is no higher authority in the world. Okay, there's no like super nation we can go to that like if there's a problem, they're gonna come in and save the day and prevent the various problems that we are facing. So, nations want to be strong, nations want to be secure. Coming back to this, what is the real story behind Allied freakout? In a world where you no longer feel like Big Brother of the United States, like in a good way, not like a scary 1984, but like in a way like you get punked at school and your big brother comes and beats him up. When you no longer know that your big brother is going to come beat up your bully the next day, you need to get jacked, right? You need to learn karate or something, or you just need to walk up to the baddest guy on the prison yard, give him one, okay? That's what we're worried Israel's going to do. Okay? Or in the case of Japan, we're not quite that worried because they're a little more constrained, right? But we are worried they're going to start doing some reps. We're worried they're going to go to the gun store and start looking at guns. You know, they're going to start arming their country more, right? Because they disarmed them this way. South Korea, we're just worried they're going to do anything at all with North Korea or China, right? That would cause problems. That's Allied freakout in that sense, right? They will take some action that is aggressive, that could cause issues. Or maybe they proliferate. They decide that they're going to start building up their own nuclear weapons, etc., etc. All of those are functions of Allied freakout. But the second subset that I really like is this idea of sort of basing rights. Okay? One of the biggest benefits the United States has when we talk about its military in comparison to China has nothing to do with the number of troops or the number of boats or any of that stuff. It has to do with the fact that we have bases all over the world. The United States has bases in the Philippines, and has bases in Japan, and has bases in South Korea, and has bases in Germany, and so on and so forth, right? And that affords us the ability to rapidly respond when bad stuff happens. If China decides it's going to try and roll in the South China Sea, yeah, we have fleets, yeah, we have the Navy in general, but we also just have our people in the Philippines who are ready to go, and the people in South Korea and the people in Japan, which is why we're so worried about getting kicked out of places like Japan because of all the assault stuff that's happening and so on and so forth, all those bases. So basing rights really matter for responding, easing tensions. But the second thing, and this is probably my favorite argument to make as it pertains to Allied confidence, is disaster response. Okay? Our ability to respond when there's just a hurricane or a typhoon in somewhere in Southeast Asia or whatever is constrained by our ability to have bases or not. If we have people in the Philippines who can do disaster response, then they can immediately start helping with those problems. But if we don't, then it takes us literally days to get there. And when it comes to disasters, if you look up the statistics on this, Literally hour by hour, the response time increases or decreases like in a crazy way, like exponentially, the amount of lives saved. If you can respond in the first hour, you can save like a huge amount of people, but literally the second hour, that number's cut in half and so on and so forth. If it takes us any more time to get someplace, that is bad. Basing help solves that problem. And crucially, what I like so much about this story is you don't have to win a single thing about China trying to invade somewhere or Russia annexing territory. You have to win that hurricanes are real. And they are, so it's pretty easy to do that, okay? The next thing that I want to talk about before we get to the big boys is economy / science collaboration. So, one thing a lot of people don't think about when we start talking about the hedge debate is, what is hedge good for, other than the United States like flexing its muscles and just being strong and bald eagles and jets flying everywhere, right? The argument from people who are very pro-hedge is that like the United States, being the strongest country in the world and able to just like kind of rock people's shit whenever they want, is literally what facilitates global trade and global scientific collaboration in general. So, for instance, trade can't happen if people are worried that China is just going to intercept your ships anytime you go through the South China Sea. Okay? It can't happen if we're worried about the same thing happening anywhere near Russia. If there's not freedom of navigation rights, as they're called, right? If you're not allowed to bring your boat in, you're not allowed to fish, you're not allowed to defend your own territory, other countries can come in and just expand. And most people would agree that economic interdependence is a good thing. Because when we have economic interdependence, we know that countries that are economically connected are less and less likely to go to conflict with one another because it would hurt them to engage in those kinds of retaliations. But scientific collaboration, I think, is another really sick thing people don't talk about enough. I learned this recently from one of my students, Matt Atomi. He's talking to me about this. Kid's really smart. Shout out Matt. Enjoy law school. One of the things that was the worst effects of 9/11 was actually that it really, really slowed down global scientific collaboration, right? Because research from like anyone, from like the Middle East, for instance, during that time, that could have been useful for things like climate change or whatever, was being intercepted or destroyed, or people were being like arrested for it. And in general, scientific collaboration was being discouraged because there was fears that whatever science you were doing could ultimately be used for like proliferation or could end up in the hands of non-state actors, and that could cause problems, right? So when countries are at war, they don't do science together, okay? And doing science together is obviously really key to solving problems like climate change, extinction, all of those sort of things. Now, maybe a little bit more of a stretch, but it's a solid thing to have in the chamber in case you want to read it. So the last story I want to talk about is just the most obvious one, which is sort of just vertical escalation in general. Vertical escalation. And this is probably the story that if you've read this before, you're more or less familiar with. Countries have agreements with one another, many of them do at least, especially the United States and China and Russia and so on and so forth, that if their ally gets attacked, they're going to show up to the fight. Okay, if you attack this country, the United States is legally obligated, quote unquote, to engage with them, or at least will have an interest in doing so. And so when one major country attacks another major country, very quickly it becomes a problem. That's why we have things like NATO. The entire point of NATO for all those countries that aren't the United States is that if someone screws with NATO, the United States is going to come rock your shit. Now the point for the United States is the basic, right? Once again, and having access to all of those pipeways and economic interdependence and so on and so forth. But bottom line, the general story of hegemony is whatever you do when it affects hegemony causes vertical escalation. Even if it starts as a small conflict that will draw in bigger and bigger nations, those nations most likely eventually have nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons cause nuclear war, things of that nature. Even if they don't go that big, we have things like resource conflicts, right? Where we have conflicts just over like territory of land or securing access to food, metals, whatever it is that we need. Bottom line, you always need to argue that small stuff will happen and then ultimately it's really big. And what I want to stress here is a lot of people skip the small stuff and they just go straight to nuclear war. And I don't think that's particularly strategic because The great thing about having a whole chain of scenarios where one ends in nuclear war but starts with a bunch of really reasonable stuff is that at any point when the other team goes, there's no way there's nuclear war, you can go, okay, you're right, and then just walk it back to here. And now it's more reasonable, right? But if you just go for nuclear war and they just read a bunch of reasons that's stupid, you've now lost access to all of these smaller scenarios that still could have won the debate. So that's really what I want to talk about with hegemony. There's a lot of ways to sort of discuss that, but bottom line, I think that is an important understanding for what's going on there. Now, I'm not going to discuss this right now. What the follow-up question is, how do you win this discussion? How do you win that hedge is good now? What does hedge being good look like? Why does the plan influence hedge, and so on and so forth? And how do we prove that it's good, but not so good that it can't be thumped? All of that you can worry about later, but the real thing is, and the whole point of me doing this discussion for my students, you have to understand the stories. This is what you need to be able to explain. And crucially, something I haven't really discussed yet, the reason you want to know these stories ahead of time is because of prep. When you're new, and a lot of my kids are figuring this out, the hardest part is just straight up writing down what your coach tells you to write down. But if you know all of this, I can just tell you, we're going to update the uniqueness, we're going to change the link to be about whatever the plan is, and you can just write down this much, that's it, but be able to explain for 10 minutes, whatever, not that you would do that in a debate because you only get like 2 minutes, why that position's good. Not having to prep your internal links and impacts is the biggest step between being just kind of okay and winning a lot of debates for a ton of people, because it saves time, and debate really at the end of the day is about time. Questions about hegemony? We got the Sleepy Bear behind the camera. Sleepy Bear, you got any questions? No? Okay, that's great. Oh, Canada. All right. So that is hedge. So we just got one last one. And then we're done. Politics. Now, politics, or TICS as it gets called a lot of the time, takes different formats. Right now, kind of the only politics that makes any sense to read is like midterm politics. And really when you say politics, you don't even mean midterm politics, you mean election politics. Generally, a politics disad is passing the plan trades off with passing some other plan. There's some other bill that would be good if it happened, but we pass your plan instead. Now we don't get that bill, it's bad. So what did that look like the last year or the last 2 years? Joe Biden's infrastructure bill. The argument was always, if you pass your plan, that'll somehow short circuit the passing of the infrastructure bill. Infrastructure bill really matters. If you don't get it, that's super bad. It matters more than your bill, don't do it. We're past that because, again, it's like we're at the point of the year where the only thing that makes sense is elections because it's in November, and after that there'll be a whole new Congress, so all the bills go away anyway. Let's talk about election politics. This one we're not going to break down from the sense of like uniqueness, link, internal link, impact. We're just going to break down what matters when it comes to an election disad. There's really a few things. The first thing is, how do we know who is winning? And the second thing is, how do we explain why voters will flip? Okay? First thing, how do we know who's winning?
Polls.
Tio says polls. Love it. One way that we can know who's winning is polls. But there's different polls. How do we know what polls are good? How do we even know what polls are saying? Okay? Like, is one poll a general poll? So the general poll, all it asks people is, if you had to vote today for a representative for your area, would you vote Republican or Democrat? Doesn't even say, like the generic ballot, doesn't even say who you'd vote for. Just which side you'd vote for. Okay? And then we have poll aggregators, like Real Clear Politics or like 538. 538 is probably the most popular one in debate by a fairly large margin. Those are polls, okay? Now, different polls have have different levels of accuracy. And if you know that, then you can win why your poll is better than someone else's poll or whatever. But they also crucially have different polling methodologies. Okay? Some polls call people, some polls are through online, some polls are done in person or whatever. And all of those have different biases in terms of Republican or Democrat or whatever based on the responding rate. All of these things can affect them. But polls are a good starting place, and that's where most people stop because they don't like doing work. Then there are markets. Okay? And markets, as an election indicator, are basically where people try and use market incentives to help predict the election. And what they really mean by that is basically like gambling / pretending it's the stock market. So one of the most famous versions of these is the Iowa electronic market, which is started, I think, by the University of Iowa. And basically, you can go on this, and people trade shares of the candidates they think they're going to win, right? So maybe one candidate shares worth 16 cents and one's worth 20 cents. And the way it works is, whatever price you get it at, if your person wins, you will get $1 per share. And so if someone's only trading at 16 cents, they're probably not going to win because it's showing that the market thinks that on average there's like an 84% chance they won't win, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So having those things can be really good. But it only matters, and I'll get to you in 1 second, Tio, it only matters if you can explain why is that a better predictor of who's going to win the election than the polls. So why would you argue, Tio, before I get your question, why would someone say markets are better than polls? What's the issue with polls? Polls are just surveys. What's the problem with surveys?
People lie.
People lie. People are biased. People don't have skin in the game. People aren't actually required to vote for the people that they poll. But if people are betting their hard-earned money on something, that probably eliminates their biases. Because it's possible to say, look, I think Hillary's going to win even if I'm not going to vote for her. So on and so forth. So that's an argument for why markets better. Tio?
So my question is, like, the markets are usually based on polls, right? Like the people like bet a certain way because the polls say things.
Potentially, right? But they could bet for any reason.
Yeah, but like, yeah, okay.
Right? And obviously, there's market makers and so on and so forth. Right. But yeah.
Okay.
Maybe some news. So like when we look at the Iowa,
they seem kind of tied together.
So here's the thing: you look at the Iowa market, electronic market. The biggest bump you'll see if you look at the last few months had nothing to do with the poll. It was the Roe v. Wade decision. The Roe v. Wade decision came out, and all of a sudden, Democrats started trading higher before polls even came out. And that's the thing, right? This can predict things before polls a lot of the time because polls take time to conduct to get the results in and so on and so forth. It's pretty much instant when the money comes in because in a market-based system, you want to be the first one to buy in because you want to get it while it's low, so on and so forth. Okay, polls, markets. Last thing is just general economic indicators. So there's like famous, I think it's called Moody's model, if I'm not mistaken, that basically takes like what's the price of gas versus what was the price of gas, what's the rate of inflation, how much does like, I don't know, lunch meat cost or some shit, and then based on that predicts who will win the election. But usually what that is relative to is that's another factor takes into consideration, the popularity of the sitting president, right? So how popular is the current president? How does that relate to those factors that are going good or bad for the economy? And how will that result in them gaining or losing seats, essentially? So those are all different things you can spend, but they're only useful if you can explain why one is better than the other. Now, what do people do? Thumpers. What are they going to come in with? All their thumpers almost certainly are just going to be poll. So what makes your uniqueness argument, your warrant, any better than theirs? How recent it is. We know that polls get better the closer we get. Or being able to explain the difference between these mechanisms. They can read all the polls they want. If you can explain why your one market indicator is better than a poll, you win the debate. So how do we know who's winning? These three things for the most part. Figure out which one you can argue. And you talk about arguing, right? The whole point of the debate is most people just stop. They just read their polls. They don't even say why their polls are better than yours. They just have more than you. But if you can explain, no, mine comes from a more accurate source, a more recent source, a more qualified source, it's market-based as opposed to polling, it's more representative, et cetera, you're going to be in a better spot. So last thing, this is really the hardest part here that people suck at. You need to be able to explain specifically, why does the plan cause voters to flip? Now, there's kind of levels to this. One level is voters in general. Another level is undecided. And the last level is swing states. Okay? So voters in general, why is a random person going to flip their vote on this? Well, for specific demographics, it changes. Obviously, Roe v. Wade probably going to make a lot of women's minds up about things if they weren't already committed to it, right? You might have been a Republican in general, you might believe in Republican fiscal responsibility, etc. But as soon as they say they're taking away the right to an abortion, you're like, well, then I don't give a shit, I'm changing my vote. Undecided people. A lot of your discussion needs to be about these people, because these people probably have made up their mind. They are Democrats, they're Republicans, they're going to vote. But we're interested in those who usually don't vote, those who usually are centrist, or those who tend to switch sides, right? Who don't vote by party alignment, they just vote based on the issues. And so, both of these, really, bracketing these two, are about issues, okay? So, stories that I think make a lot of sense that come up. There's a lot of Second Amendment people, right? Second Amendment people. So, you could swing that either way. People will vote for it because they perceive this as a crackdown on like the Second Amendment or something like that. That's their single issue, okay? There are people who are only voting based on like sort of fiscal policy, okay? And so when they do something that's fiscally irresponsible or fiscally conservative, whatever it is, that will flip their vote one way or the other. But on top of things like this, we start talking about swing state voters. Because when we're talking about the Congress, because it's not the presidential election, it's the congressional election, right? Swing states are ultimately what matter, like winning those states where the races are up for discussion in the first place. And so you start looking into things like, okay, let's talk about Second Amendment. What's a swing state? Pennsylvania, Georgia. Is there a massive rural population in those areas? Yes. Is there a hunting culture in those areas? Yes. Are those people pro Second Amendment? Probably. That's why it swings in that case, right? Or are those areas especially, are those areas really struggling with poverty or like having other infrastructure crises? Okay, now they care about fiscal responsibility, or they care about environmental policy if that's a major issue that's facing them, right? If it's Mississippi or something and you're talking about the river. So bottom line, you need to be particular to the issues, and you need to be able to convince a judge. Why would someone change their vote? Because it's not enough to just say, and these are terms you may never have heard of if you're brand new, but a lot of people just say like, winners win. This is a Republican policy, and that's a win for them. So they'll win even more. Or they say winners lose. The Republicans spent all of their political points passing the plan. Now they have no political points left. And so the Democrats just get to win for a while until the Republicans can save up more points. That's the problem with most politics scenarios that aren't election ticks. People have this like nebulous idea of political capital, like it's a bank or like a piggy bank. And like the Republicans and Joe Biden and everyone else, they have their piggy bank and they have to trade their piggy bank to get stuff done. But that's not really how it works, right? It really comes down to things like this and core issues. So that's all I want to talk about when it comes to generic disads. There's a lot of other stuff to be discussed potentially. But the real thing, again, that I'm trying to get at is you have to know your story. You have to be able to explain the internal links. Why is your story, your explanation more compelling? Why will businesses freak out? They'll freak out because they're smart. They're not even freaking out. It's just a good decision. And you've decked regulatory uncertainty. That checks back for thumpers because it's not about the size, it's about the sudden appearance. Hegemony. It's not just about getting to nuclear war. It's about all the steps along the way that we can leverage as offense or that will give us internal links into the impacts of the other team by doing things like science diplomacy or disaster response, etc., etc. And on politics, again, really, a lot of people just focus on how many polls can you read, but the fundamental question is, are polls a good determining metric? Are certain polls better than others? And crucially, regardless of all that, why will anyone actually change their vote unless you can explain it in a compelling way, like why is this an issue as it pertains to that?
You can use examples, right? Like, again, like, can I give an example real quick or not?
You want me to give you an example?
No, I'm saying you can use examples. That's like, hey, this is a previous time.
You should use examples.
Okay, got it.
Obviously, I'm not doing that right now.
Right.
All right, cool. That's it. I'm wrapping the video. Tawny, wrap the video.